Here we are, the 22nd week after Pentecost, almost careening toward the end of 2021. Not really sad about that. We thought 2021 was going to be fine and perfect after 2020, the end of COVID. And on Facebook, I see, I don't know how many of you have seen, I bet Matt has, and probably Miranda, she's probably muted right now, but there's this guy who does parodies and he wears t-shirts. One says Gen X, one says the millennial, and one has Gen Z on him, and he kind of is all three of the characters. And he did one the other day that was God in 2021 and Jesus, and I practically fell off my bed laughing because God was having a conversation with 2021, and he says, "For the love of JC," and Jesus comes out of nowhere and he goes, "Oh, you don't have to do anything for my love." And it was pretty funny. It was cute. But 2021's been hard, and not just for me. I've had, a broken ankle or 2 breaks, a bunch of oral surgeries, and now I'm sitting with kidney stones. But folks have lost people they've loved, they have lost jobs, they have lost loved ones, they have struggled with addiction because of all of those things or combined with those things. They have struggled to maintain relationships with loved ones. And I myself am pretty excited for 2022. And in the Gospel of Mark, people are struggling with what is going on, and Jesus is trying to help a hurting world. And the Gospel of Mark is like me when I do community organizing. Mark rarely has characters named. It's always a guy or a person or a woman. I always say I know a guy. Mark similarly rarely provides names for the people that Jesus heals. And the name Bartimaeus in particular is full of resonance here. We're going to talk about what the name means for a moment. Bar means son of, Timaeus. And it may have brought several things to mind from Mark's early audiences. Plato's dialogue, Timaeus, includes songs of praise to sight. Aramaic speakers, and that was Jesus's mother tongue, was likely Aramaic, may have heard a word play here on a term for unclean, and Greek speakers may have heard a word play for highly prized. So this week's story of particular interest and cultural significance for those reasons alone. And it's funny because I was reading a bunch of commentaries, but it would be like, I don't know if any of you have remember the Fast Times at Ridgemont High, right? It would be like the stoner friend in that story coming along with all the details all of a sudden and passing or acing a Civil War history test. So today in this sermon or message, I'm going to talk about a couple of things, and I'm going to push back on a couple of things with Mark as well here. But first I'm going to tell you a little story about last week before I got my kidney stones diagnosed. Last weekend, I went to Emily Scott's installation at St. Mark's Church in Baltimore. Emily was the founding pastor of St. Lydia's Dinner Church in New York. She wrote this amazing little book. I don't know if you got, yep, I know you got your pen out over there, Beth. She wrote this amazing book for all who hunger. The service was beautiful. St. Mark's is a historical church like ours, sort of. It's got a basilica inside, it's gorgeous, they've got a pipe organ, so it's sort of like ours. It's in urban Baltimore. The service was beautiful. It concluded with the signing of a covenant between St. Mark's They're ECLA, just so you know, it gives you a context of a Lutheran setting. So they've got kind of smells and bells going on too. Every time something happened, they would whip out the incense and some holy water. But they signed a covenant between St. Mark's and Dreams and Visions, which is an LGBTQ kind of church plant that Emily did in the LGBTQ community that meets upstairs in a room about this size in St. Mark's. The reception was from a catering company. I don't remember the company's name, but it was a tea company that had tea sandwiches, and you had your choice of pescatarian, vegetarian, or meat. Champagne, a beautiful cake, and bottled water. But we ate out on the street, and homeless folks were walking by, and they would be fed as well. It was absolutely a joy. It was so wonderful. There was faith in that room, but regalia, as Lutherans have, the bishop had his big, I don't even know what that's called, but they wear this big hat. The bishop had his hat on, and he had a bishop's crook as he installed her. There were rainbows and visions. There were drug deals happening as we ate our tea sandwiches. There was wealth at our table. There was poverty. I am 90% certain that a sex worker came alongside and asked for her meal. And the newly installed pastor poured her some champagne, got her a plate of food, and sent the church ladies, sent our Barb and Martha, alongside to ask her if she wanted some cake. My heart swelled as the woman who had bad teeth showed off these new boots that she got. They were hot pink, saying they'll be good when the weather gets bad. You see, they glitter. It was beautiful. Dreams and visions. An old church with a basilica, an empty room upstairs, signed a covenant. Wealth and poverty, queer folk, signed a covenant. So in our gospel today, this cry for mercy, Bartimaeus addresses Jesus as Son of David, a potent political messianic title. And he repeats it even more loudly when many sternly ordered him to be quiet. Why do they try to silence him? Do they consider him unclean, too lowly of a figure to bother this holy teacher? Are they worried that he might draw unwanted attention from the authorities as Jesus approaches Jerusalem? Or perhaps Mark is underscoring the fact that this time Jesus does not tell Bartimaeus to keep his identity a secret. Since in Mark's early chapters, Jesus frequently does just that. Where Jesus tells Peter not to tell anyone about him. Hearing Bartimaeus, Jesus stops in his tracks and sends for him. And there's a cloak in this figure, and if we think back on Mark 5, there's a cloak figure there, right? With the woman. It might first seem obvious that Bartimaeus, as he calls out to Jesus, he's asking for his eyesight to be restored. And we'll think about that in a minute. We'll talk about that a little bit. But this only makes it more surprising that Jesus doesn't heal him immediately. Instead, he asks him the same question that he has just put to James and John. What do you want me to do for you? The question does at least two things at once. First, it shows that Jesus wants Bartimaeus to play an active role, engaging in his own restoration. And second, it sets up a vivid contrast between James and John on the one hand, and Bartimaeus on the other. While the supposed insiders display spiritual hubris with their answer, they want seats of honor, right, next to Jesus. So that'll be fun. Different fire. Yeah? Smoke detector. The supposed outsider models fitting blends of boldness and humility. My teacher, let me see again. Right? He says, a request that in the context of this part of Mark has both physical but maybe spiritual dimensions as well. Perhaps like the folks at Dreams and Visions or at St. Mark's, right? It should never cease to strike us that Jesus's line after line of healing is not come follow me, I have healed you, but rather go do what you're called to do. Your faith has made you well. Jesus rarely says, come follow me. He says, go. The next step is ours, or Bartimaeus'. So far from pointing towards himself as the guy we should follow, Jesus sets us free. And he does the same for Bartimaeus. Now, I want to talk about a few things. I want to critique this text a little bit, and I want to free you to do the same, because I wouldn't do this in my grandma's church. But this isn't my grandma's church, is it? This isn't a story about a blind man being healed. We need to change, or at least free ourselves to critique this and change our language around disability, particularly in the Bible. Bartimaeus was not a blind man. Bartimaeus was a man who happened to suffer from blindness. His faith gave him vision beyond his disability, right? And we use person first language here. And no matter which translation I used, he's referred to as what? Y'all have masks on, but
Blind man.
a blind man. There was no translation that I could go to, none, that I found him described any other way. And that's problematic. That's a problem with our Bible. That's a problem. He was a man who happened to be blind. That's my first issue with this. Jesus, the second we're going to talk about, Jesus had no expectations. Healing for Jesus, William Barber says this: Jesus requires no copays. I think that's very interesting, right? There's no trade with Christ, which I didn't grow up thinking, right? There was always a currency or a transaction with salvation. You give your life to Christ because Christ gave his life for me. Jesus had no expectations that healing Bartimaeus would require anything of Bartimaeus. He didn't expect Bartimaeus to follow him. The line says, go, not come, not follow me. Bartimaeus was free to follow whatever dreams he had for himself. If he wanted to be a painter with his new sight, he could have done so. That is a freeing salvation, not a binding one. Interesting enough, I think it takes audacity to follow Jesus, to dream and to vision. And this audacity continues. Though Jesus tells him to go, he comes, he follows. He comes along and following Jesus along the way, even though they're just a day's journey from the coming showdown in Jerusalem. In Mark, faith is typically a synonym for courage, a form of audacity. And this week's story is no exception. Bartimaeus boldly calls out to Jesus, refuses to be silent, even if it rankles the imperial authorities. He leaves behind his possessions, forthrightly for healing and insight, and follows Jesus all the way to Jerusalem. He is nothing less than a model disciple, even though those other disciples have had years, have had training. He's an outsider who outshines the insiders. You know, I watched this group of homeless folks or outsiders at the church sharing meals together. As Mark tells it, Bartimaeus is the last disciple to join the fold. And just a few verses ago in Mark, what does Jesus say? The last will be first. And we likely won't have people showing up here, showing off their pink boots like they do at St. Mark's, but we have to be more intentional, right? We get to be more creative. We get to reach out to places like Frederick Center, seeking out those who need a church home, a cloak to heal, a sanctuary, a respite from the storm. But those folks do exist for us. And we can be actively audacious in helping them find their church, our church. Amen.